had started to slide, right, a little bit. In fact, engaging in some syncretism, probably for political reasons. He was ruling over not just Israel, right? Remember that there were nations that were not under an extermination mandate in the land that were his subjects, although they might distinguish between, in that culture and that time, between subjects and citizens. It wasn't a matter of who could vote and who couldn't because nobody voted. But there was a distinction between those who had a right to their property, hereditary, perpetual right to their property, and those who were nations living under the rule of Israel in the land. And that was predicted to be a problem, right? They were told to limit interaction, not to worship who they were worshiping. And so there's this weird event, right, where Solomon goes up on a high place. He goes up on a high place, the high place at Gibeon, which happened to be also, we decided to remember, where the tabernacle was, no longer the residence of the Ark of the Covenant. They had been separated by David earlier in the history of Israel. But he makes a very pagan-sounding sacrifice there. And so it seems to me that he was kind of politicizing that a little bit. We know that God takes seriously conflation between the anointed offices in Israel, particularly by the king. The king was the one that was supposed to monitor and evaluate and to discipline to some degree those anointed offices. 1 Kings 3, Bill, is where we are. And he was the one charged with executive action, right? So, in other words, some things like that, David told him, you need to depose these priests. These priests need to be not serving actively. Well, that was the king's job to do that. To some degree, we see the prophet acting at substantial liability to life and limb, right? The prophets like Nathan come and confront the king. But in general, the king also had executive authority to some degree as the prophets under their normal function, right? The Lord had to specifically tell them, you need to go confront the king right now. And it may cost you your life, but you have to do it anyway. That was an exception, right? But generally speaking. So Solomon had his rule consolidated. We're going to talk about some of the construction projects that he's going to engage in. One of them, of course, is the temple. That's what he's known for. And we have a record, kind of like with David, right? There was the complimentary record. This is David on his good days. This is what David did, all the good things that David did. And then part of that second part of 2 Samuel was, but he wasn't perfect, right? So we're going to see the same thing in the record. But Solomon has a promise. He has a covenant. He's a recipient of a covenant from David. He's a recipient of a personal covenant from Yahweh himself as someone who's following that rule. But David was told that each of your descendants, each of your heirs, has the right to occupy the throne individually during their lifetime if they follow the Mosaic law. Remember, that's not the same thing as the Davidic covenant. The unconditional Davidic covenant has no conditions, and that's about the final righteous seed that would rule over the kingdom in perpetuity. The one seed that would do that, and that prophetic element has not been fulfilled yet. But in the interim, between that coming of the one righteous seed and David's reign, each of his heirs were additionally blessed that if they were faithful to the Lord, they would occupy the throne. And so that's where Solomon is. And Solomon has been told that he would be unique because of his singular request, his unique request that he didn't seek wealth, he didn't seek riches, he didn't seek women, he didn't seek the country song, old faster horses, younger women, and older whiskey. Any of those things, that wasn't him. But the Lord blessed him with all of the other things because he was wise enough to ask for wisdom even after his syncretism, even after what was edging on failure. I'm not going to say that he had utterly failed, but I think that was a politicization is that word? Yeah, of his role. I think he was making some concessions that he shouldn't have made there. And one, just offering the sacrifices on behalf of the nation for himself. I don't think that was a good idea. I don't think that 1,000 sacrifices were warranted. So there's all sorts of things that are just iffy. Anyway, so he has that covenant. He has that blessing promised. And he has prayed, right, back to the Lord and kind of accepted the offer, right, and blessed him. So Exhibit A of his wisdom, right, is actually a fairly narrow thing. Like you would not expect the king, like you would not go, let's say, all these people are coming now to visit Donald Trump now from all over the world. He's not even president yet. They're like, we better go, shake hands, right? That's kind of what's happening. I don't think, a friend of mine noted that nobody did that for Joe Biden. I don't think Joe Biden's handlers would have let him have that exposure. We already knew that his brain was oatmeal, right? But I mean, you know that's happening because his influence, his decisions will be immediately global in impact, right? And so we wouldn't expect this to be Exhibit A of Solomon's wisdom, right? Because this is a family court issue, right? What we're going to see. This story, everyone knows this story. In fact, it's proverbial even outside of Christianity. Solomon, everyone goes, what's it? You've heard people who don't even know who Solomon is. They've never read the Bible. Like, well, let's divide that baby, right? So that's what we're going to look at today. You have to, sometimes you got to divide the baby, of course. Solomon doesn't actually do that, by the way. So we'll see. So this is Exhibit A of his wisdom, and it's unique. It's designed to show his uniqueness, right? Some people are designed better to make good decisions in a big picture. Some people are bean counters. And I mean, I don't use that disparagingly. I'm very happy that the same bean counter who's been doing my taxes for 25 years very precisely and keeps the IRS happy with all the weirdness that is pastoral compensation. They get audited all the time, and I have not yet been audited, thankful for my bean counter. That's been nice. So I don't use that disparagingly, right? But some people are forest people and some people are leaf people, and Solomon has wisdom for both, which is part of the uniqueness, which is why I think Appendix A is here as proof. Let's look at it. The two women who were harlots, or then two women who were harlots, came to the king and stood before him. Unique thing number one, and what category when two harlots could stand before anybody but the municipal judge, right? Anyway, the two women who were harlots came to the king and stood before him. So this is unique, right? The one woman said, "Oh my lord, this woman and I live in the same house, and I gave birth to a child while she was in the house." Okay, so you live there, no, right there. This is their business, and this comes along with the business certainly back in the day. It happened on the third day after I gave birth, that this woman also gave birth to a child, and we were together. There was no stranger with us in the house, only the two of us in the house. So that's the setting, right? They live together. Neither one of them have a husband. Both of them have intimate relations with people for a business. Within 3 days, right, infants look pretty similar, right? I won't say that newborn babies aren't cute, but they're not at their cutest, right? They all look quite similar. They look like raisins, little grumpy raisins all the time when they're little like that, when they're that size. Our twins, right, we actually painted a toenail or a fingernail on one of them just to make sure that we knew which was which for a while, because they were so similar in appearance, and they're identical twins. And so they've gone back and forth, but that first month was tough keeping them straight. So legitimately in this situation, you could wonder if there's going to be some ambiguity. So verse 19, this woman's son died in the night because she lay on it, which is a horrible, horrible thing. I have a friend who's a former drug addict, and was high on cocaine and smothered his infant son. And he has never, ever, ever recovered from it, mentally or emotionally. He has had other children, but it's a real problem. And there may have been, given the nature of the business, some substances involved. Who knows who was under some sort of influence here. But this seems to have been what happened. Somebody laid on their baby. Somebody did. I have no reason to doubt that part of the record. So she arose in the middle of the night and took my son from beside me while your maidservant slept, and laid him in her bosom, and laid her dead son in my bosom. And when I rose in the morning to nurse my son, behold, he was dead. But when I looked at him carefully in the morning, behold, he was not my son whom I had born. And the other woman said, "No, for the living one is my son, and the dead one is your son." But the first woman said, "No, for the dead one is your son. The living one is my son." Thus they spoke before the king. So what's the issue, and why does the king care? What is the one thing that a harlot might have in the society in her life that would be of a long-term benefit to her? Anybody? Think patriarchally here.
A son who would take care of her?
An heir, a son, a man to take care of her in her old age. Y'all realize that even in the ancient world, there was a shelf life on how long you can engage in this business. Even for women who decided to make it their living, right? This is one of the tragedies of our modern culture, is that so many women in their late teens and mid to early 20s are doing OnlyFans, right? Have you all heard of that, right? It's essentially digital harlotry. That people pay for subscriptions for this, and they don't realize what it's costing them, right? It's costing them largely the future of a family, future of an heirship, right? It's actually worse than what's happening here in this case. Tremendously widespread, people thinking that they can make $100,000 a year. I'm not saying that making $100,000 a year for 6 years of your life is not worth what you're throwing away in your life, which is likely your best childbearing years and your best hope at finding a husband that will love you and care for you for decades is at that time in your life. And so these people were similar, right? They had made a decision to engage in this business, and it was not a hopeful business long term, but the son that they bore, in fact, was a blessing in their life, and would be a means for care for them in their old age. And so there's something that they're fighting over. See, in our culture, probably you'd have two women fighting over who had to keep the live baby, right? Isn't that terrible? That's terrible, but that is, I think, reasonable to think that you could see a scenario that was entirely reversed. And you have some reverberations of this event, right? And actually, if you get just to the very next book, 2 Kings 6, right? We're talking about divided kingdom in 2 Kings 6 at that point. And Samaria is under siege, and they're arguing over whose child they're going to eat, right? And I think there's a book matched element to the historical record here. This was how great Solomon's wisdom was, and this is how bad the divided kingdom became, right? And I don't know that it's technically, you guys, you like your chiasms, right? A little too much, probably. Chiasms most of them aren't real, frankly, and they're not that useful interpretively, but the Bible does seem to have one in the big picture, with Christ at the center of it. So don't make too big of a deal out of it any more than you would make a big deal out of numerology. You know what numerology is? They're on the same order of interpretive value, quite frankly. So anyway, but those are kind of book matched parallel events demonstrating the two extremes of the kingdom between Solomon and the divided kingdom. Anyway, so they're fighting over whose heir, whose son is alive. And this record, we're not sure who was who in the record, but it seems like it was valid. These events happen, but the dispute is only which character did what. The dead one is your son, the living one is my son. Thus they spoke before the king. And the king said, the one says, this is my son who is living, and your son is the dead one. And the other says, no, for your son is the dead one, and my son is the living one. So get a paternity test. Oh, wait. Can't do that. Now, is it likely, this is kind of dismal, in a house of two harlots, it's possible that both children had the same father, maybe even looked the same, especially at 3 days distant. But Solomon identified his issue, right? It's her word against yours. We just talked about that, right, with A&W Root Beer and Eric's Papa Burger. Did you not hear about that? Some people know Eric's Papa Burger got sued here in poor old El Paso. Family owns 3 restaurants, and they get sued by A&W Root Beer for the name Papa Burger. your word against ours, whether we were stealing your trademark or not, basically. And they folded. And so now it's Eric's Papa Burger, right? They couldn't decide, they couldn't discriminate. So a lot of people would have simply said, I don't know, right? It's your word against ours. You guys are both harlots, right? Not quite as bad as tax collectors, actually, became, and like in Matthew, we looked at that, tax collectors were not even allowed to testify in the Jewish courts in Jesus' day. That is, women in Islam, right, are discounted in their testimony in court, right? And normally in ancient Near Eastern world, women coming before the king, particularly harlots coming before the king, probably just wouldn't happen. So Solomon is not only wise, he is extremely gracious in allowing us to come before his court. I don't know how many times it went to a local magistrate before it got to Solomon, but it's just a unique situation. Why anybody would do that. And so he understands the problem immediately. The king said, get me a sword. So they brought me a sword. So they brought a sword before the king. So it's getting serious, right? So now there's a couple ways this can go down, right? Why does the king want a sword? Well, he could kill both the harlots, because under the Mosaic law, they were probably worthy of that, and spare the child being raised by a harlot. Yeah? Yeah? You guys are infected by modern society, aren't you? This is a modern argument for abortion, right? Is that the children that are being aborted largely would have a terrible life because they'd be raised by terrible parents. The prevalence of terrible parents in the United States is substantial, right? We can't argue with that. You have 50% of people dumb enough to vote the way they've been voting for the last century, or 20 years. It tells you that they've been raised poorly by poor people with poor abilities for rational thought, right? That's never a warrant, right? So in any case, who's absolutely the innocent in this case? The baby is absolutely the innocent. And so, however, the harlots have been, anyway, the situation might have been dealt with differently by a wise king with a different worldview in a different nation. So get the sword. So the king says, divide the living child in two and give half to the one and half to the other. Now, whenever I was taught this when I was a kid, I said, well, Solomon never intended to do that. I don't think you should say that. I don't think you should say that. I don't think that you should ascribe falsehood to the king. I think that he actually probably would have done it. I think so. Because there's a third possibility here, right? That this child belongs to neither of them. Right? Yes? Yes. Possible, they're harlots. Possible that somebody kidnapped this child and it belongs to neither of them. Right? That's a possibility. That's a possibility. Solomon is dealing with a variety of possibilities here. So, divide the living child in two and give half to the one and half to the other. Best case scenario, I do think that he is anticipating that someone is telling the truth and no one has not going to do this. Then the woman whose child was a living one spoke to the king, for she was deeply stirred over her son, and said, O my lord, give her the living child, and by no means kill him. But the other said, he shall be neither mine nor yours, divide him. All right. So who is, based on Pentateuch precedent, who's the righteous one here? Anybody think of somebody else that gave up their child rather than having the child die? Greatest prophet. There you go. There you go. It shouldn't be that hard, guys. Wasn't that long ago, right? Moses was sent into the Egyptian's court, right? Pharaoh's court, in order to preserve his life from Pharaoh, which is always, very interesting and unique aspect of that story. And she would rather have served as the wet nurse for her own son rather than to see the child die. This is the end that I think Solomon was anticipating, but it was not guaranteed. And he himself acknowledged that there was no way that he could actually determine that based simply on testimony, right? So the king said, give the first woman the living child, and by no means kill him. She is his mother. No paternity test necessary, no DNA test necessary. And when all of Israel heard of the judgment which the king had handed down, they feared the king, for they saw that the wisdom of God was in him to administer justice. Yeah, Bill, you have something to say? You look like you have a comment. I fear that king too, right?
Well,
yeah.
I'll bet you that two women didn't live together after that.
Well, I would imagine not. I would imagine that was pretty much a foregone conclusion after they went to court. Although weird things happen, right? During, actually multiple times in my lifetime. The real estate crash in 08, the COVID economic crap, even right now, with interest rates where they are, you find people that have filed for divorce, and they've been filed for divorce for a decade, and they can't afford to divorce, so they end up living together. You can't imagine if you could live together because your checkbook is a little light, why can't you live together, and unfile for your divorce, right? Weird things happen. But I imagine that they probably didn't give them a choice, right? They had a choice. And I will just point out, right, that the justice, wise justice, righteous justice, does on occasion at least appear violent. And if it doesn't, it's probably not just. The consequences of injustice, right? It is one of the things that the whole rubric that justice is now private, right? When was the last time we had public executions at the federal level in the United States? Anybody remember? We stick them in a closet and inject them. And you probably ought to understand that people who disagree with capital punishment have an argument based on that how much of a deterrent is capital punishment if you're doing it in Huntsville in a basement and nobody sees it? Because it's more expensive to actually bring somebody to execution than it is to execute them. They're right about all of that. But for it to serve as a deterrent, it needs to be public. It was public in Israel, by the way. All of the executions for all of the capital crimes that people are convicted of were public, and God explicitly states that the reason for that is because that's the only way it functions as a deterrent, right? So justice must appear and must be obviously and evidently violent when it is righteous, right? Right? You don't have to agree with me yet, but if you don't end up agreeing with me, I don't think you can be right, right? That's not right. Eventually, you can think about it, you can chew on it, but I've chewed about this most of my lifetime, because this was one of the earliest things that bothered me about our justice system as a kid was why, because you watch Westerns, right? You think that everybody was walking around having, how could all the people have the shootouts at noon? Because there were so many shootouts. Well, there was almost none. And in every Western, they're always building a gallows right in the middle of downtown. Well, that's because life was boring, because it was relatively peaceful and quiet and prosperous in general, and people left each other alone and lived far away. And so the only thing they had left to make a movie about was the hangings and the shootouts, right? So that's the idea, right? But when they did it, it was public and effective as a deterrent at that point. So anyway, I think we need to take that as a principle, right? We're not under the law, right? And there's some discretion involved, right? As I pointed out, both the harlots probably were worthy of execution themselves under the Mosaic law. And so, like the guys, there's always several a year that you hear about in the news that call the cops because their drug deal went bad, that they got their cocaine stolen or their pot stolen out of the trunk of their Hyundai. And they call the cops because they've been robbed, and both of them get arrested, right? So there's a discretion involved here that Solomon could have executed all of the adults involved here, but left the child orphan and without a father. Anyway, so that was the administration of justice, and the nation recognized that the violent or hypothetically, potentially violent character of Solomon's justice was an example of his wisdom. and a supernatural example of his wisdom to administer justice. All right. Any questions, comments, accusations of heresy? Observation. Karen has an accusation of heresy.
No.
All right, lay it on me, Karen.
You're cool.
I always catch them.
No,
I get them. All right.
Don always wondered why they took away public firing squads. He
Yeah.
always wanted that.
Well, I think it's the same thing, is that it became politically tumultuous to do it. Like there was so much sentiment against execution. I think it's in North Carolina. You can still request to be
Yeah, you
executed
can.
by firing squad. And I don't know because there's a really a philosophical problem with the way we do capital punishment in Texas, actually, because they use controlled substances. And the only people who can administer controlled substances are doctors, functionally, or nurse practitioners or nurses under supervision, all of whom have taken an oath not to kill people or do harm to people. And so it's a real philosophical problem that if the only people that we can have administer a lawful execution are people who have given an oath not to harm people's lives or bring about their death, then what's the character of our execution, right? So that's a real problem. I don't have a problem. I mean, everything has a liability, right? The electric chair, have you ever watched somebody in an electric chair? It's not, killing people is not humane. Capital punishment is not humane. Stoning is probably the most violent. Yeah. Which is, I've mentioned this when we go through the Pentateuch, and that is that the parents were not excluded. Like, so when they had to bring their son and say, my son is rebellious, he's disobedient, he needs to be stoned, the parents had to participate. So it was not only a public execution, it was public participation in execution as a deterrent, I think, against frivolously doing so. Right, so I had a very volatile parent who probably would have dragged me before the magistrates multiple times up until I was about 30, and probably again in my 40s, and she had the opportunity, right? So I'm glad, right, that there was a caution against frivolous accusations, which was you had to throw the stone if you were going to bring your son before the magistrate like that. But you realize that nothing's perfect, right? So there's stories in the French Revolution, right? So they drag everybody that has a landed title and they execute them, and they use the guillotine, which was super humane compared to what they've been doing at a point. And the people who are getting their heads chopped off start laughing at the crowd as their head falls into a basket, because you still have enough nervous connection or whatever, you still have enough oxygen in your brain that you're conscious for a second or two that your head was just cut off. There's nothing that is absolute. I know that's grotesque, but I mean the argument against capital punishment that it's not humane, none of it is humane, but it's also not humane to allow, and God's very clear about this, under the law. Again, we're not under the law. I'm not required to have capital punishment for the exact same things that capital punishment was for under the law, but capital punishment, the validation for it exists prior to the Mosaic law. If a man sheds a man's blood, by man his blood shall be shed. That's trans-dispensational. And it wasn't a question of whether it was humane or not. It was a matter of what it had to function in society as a deterrent. And so the way we do it now, I just don't think that's, just doesn't do it. And with predictable results.
I think burning at the stake is right there with stoning.
Yeah. Well, I mean, all of them are horrible. Stoning, burning, stake, drowning, I've heard is a horrid thing to do. I mean, I would not support doing things the most terrible way possible, right? Which is what.
Torture.
Yeah, right. But I mean, if you're trying to do it with no pain and no suffering and no consciousness, that's not reasonable. That's not reasonable. It's just not violent. Righteous justice appears violent. That's just not, and that's kind of my point. We can't object to righteous justice because it turns somebody's stomach. Right? It's supposed to turn the wicked people's stomach. That's how it functions as a deterrent. All right. So I'm not Solomon, right? And to be fair, I probably would have put the kid in somebody else's care or taken him into my house and chopped the harlots in half. So, chapter 4, we got a few more minutes here. So again, this is a record of Solomon's successes, right? And Solomon of his wealth, of the abundance of God adhering faithfully to his conditional covenant that he gave Solomon, was that he would be unique, that he would rule over a golden era of the monarchy and the United Kingdom of Israel. That's basically what he said. There'll be no one like you. There's been no one like you before you. There'll be no one like you after you. So do your best and hope it trickles down as best as possible. Right. So King Solomon was king over all Israel. This has a shelf life, right? We've already pointed that before this, back in the time of Judges and even in Joshua, actually, you had inklings of a distinction between tribes, between literally, basically between Judah and what becomes the northern kingdom of Israel. There's already that. It may go back all the way to that chapter, Genesis 49, right? Where there's the prediction that the scepter would not depart from Judah until Shiloh comes. And there was this presumption of favoritism, if you will, right? Then that was always an issue in the patriarchal period. And so that may go back there. I won't die on that hill, so don't try to kill me there. But it was already there. And so it's a big deal when King Solomon was over all Israel. The fact that David went from ruling over just Judah for 7 years to going to ruling over all Israel was a major turning point. That he was able to consolidate his rule, and that Solomon maintained that rule. Right? So that's a great summary statement. These were his officials. Azariah, the son of Zadok, was the priest. Remember, Zadokite priesthood is a very important principle. Elihoreph, it's a Bible name you don't hear very often. And Ahijah, the sons of Shishah, were secretaries. Jehoshaphat, you live in Appalachia, you do run across that one once in a while. Jehoshaphat, the son of Ahilud, was the recorder, and Benaiah, the son of Jehoiada, was over the army. Zadok and Abiathar were priests. Remember, Abiathar, though, was dismissed at some point. Right? Azariah, the son of Nathan, was over the deputies. Zebud, the son of Nathan, a priest, was the king's friend. Imagine that. The king's friend. It doesn't take much, guys, for you to not know who your friends actually are. Kings have this problem a lot. That's probably one of the highest honors in this list. Was not that you were employed by the king in an honorable position, but you were the king's friend. And Ahishar was over the household, and Adoniram, the son of Abda, was over the men subject to forced labor. Anybody want to clutch their pearls now? There was forced labor in Israel.
That was the Canaanites that they didn't subdue.
Some of them, yeah. The haulers of wood and water, cutters of wood and haulers of water. Gibeonites, there's several different people groups that were subject to forced labor. Why was that positive? So you guys, we've talked about this dynamic, right? There was a point in the ancient world, right, that people willingly sold themselves into forced servitude, forced labor. And they did it under righteous rule back in Egypt, right? Joseph was the second in command over all Israel, and by the time he was done wisely executing his duties, every Egyptian citizen in the whole country, literally, physically, belonged to the Pharaoh. And why was that considered beneficial?
In order to eat.
You're right, they were going to die otherwise, right? In this case, a lot of these people would have been subject to an execution mandate if they didn't agree to be haulers of water and cutters of wood, which is one category of forced labor. It wasn't the only category of labor, certainly, that was done. It was not like Rome, right? Rome got to be where the citizens of the country did nothing and the slaves did everything. That, of all the things that Romans did well and wisely to make your citizenry lazy, slovenly, unintelligent, and unaccustomed to labor, was probably the biggest foolish one that we can think of, or that I can think of, aside from the immorality. I think those two things go together. You have everybody sitting on their butts all day, just partying all day. They start to get curious about things that they would never even have energy to do.
And unwilling to take up arms.
And unwilling to take up arms, they didn't fight as well. So Rome transitioned into this, right? But that was, in Israel, that was not the case. There were, everybody was responsible to till their own property, right? To farm their own property. If they wanted vineyards, They were handed homes they didn't have to build. They were handed vineyards they didn't have to plant, and fields that they didn't have to plow, right? That was the nature of the blessing. One of the reasons, right, that Joshua, we pointed this out, had to go and overthrow the people individually was because if God just sent SARS, COVID, whatever, number 01 and wiped everybody out, the land would go wild, right? And God was like, this is supposed to be easy peasy. This is supposed to be already prepared for you. That's the whole point of leaving these people here for centuries, was to make sure the land was cultivated, it was a land flowing with milk and honey, and you weren't have to engage every single aspect of the curse in order to take the promised land. Right? You weren't supposed to deal with the land producing thorns and thistles for centuries before you took it over again. And God Himself declares that, right? That's Isaiah chapter 5. Where God talks about the fact that He prepared the land as a vineyard for the people. But when they abandoned Him, He's the one that tore it down. He's the one that laid it waste, leaving the vines planted. In other words, not making it not a vineyard, but He is causing the vines to suffer. So anyway, there was forced labor. There was not forced labor. It was better than dying. And so they needed somebody to administer that. So verse 7, any questions about that section? It's just a list of people, right? These are good, high quality guys. We could go through each character study and see. We've already talked about Benaiah at multiple junctures. Super courageous guy. Zadok as a faithful priest. Elahoreph and Ahijah, I think, are, those are singular references, right? As far as I know. There may be some other reference there to them, but I don't know where it is. All right. So Solomon had 12 deputies over all Israel who provided for the king and his household. Each man had to provide for a month in the year. In other words, he was responsible for providing for the king's household. 1/12 of the king's household in a year. That was the form of taxation. That was an additional form of taxation that they levied against these folks. In order to, and this is important, I think, Solomon is consolidating and centralizing his rule, right? Because up to this point, you have the Confederate States of Israel. So, can I say it that way? You have very tribalistic view of each territory, right? And there are some weaknesses to that. And what they needed to do was to create, if not entire loyalty being supplanted, they needed people to understand what was happening and what God was doing in the nation. Because it was the Davidic dynasty's job to rule over all of Israel, to actually rule it. In our system, you could argue, right? In fact, I believe somebody may find an exception, but in my reading, every state constitution in the United States still acknowledges that each state is an independent republic in this country. That they are, and that the federal government is very, very limited in what they do. Now, the federal government doesn't know that anymore. The federal government is the largest parasite in this country at this point. Right. Oh, no, many of the states do not either, but their constitutions still reflect, even post-Reconstruction, even in the southern states, that each state has the right to self-rule. Texas always has that bragging right that we did it before and we can do it again. And we really could. We've gone from 8th or 9th in the world, economy-wise, to number 6, I think, bumping towards number 5 compared to nations. I'm not comparing to other states or the political units, economic. So we really could. But anyway, the point being, Solomon is taking something that is a fractured, tribalistic view of what constitutes the nation, which is simply mutual aid agreement, right? If somebody gets attacked by the Philistines or the Moabites or whatever, they're going to come to each other's aid into a functional nation, and that's what they're doing. And so, does Solomon need this to happen? No, but the tribes need to contribute. They need to pay tribute in order that they understand where the centrality of the government is. And that is something that can be done well or something that can be done poorly. This seems pretty reasonable. So all of them provided for his household for 1 month in the year. These are their names: Ben-Hur in the hill country of Ephraim, Ben-Deker and Kaz and Shaalbim and Beth-Shemesh and Elam-Beth-Hanan. Anybody want to read these names? Ben-Hesed and Arabah, Sokoh was his, and all the land of Hefer. Ben-Abinadab and all the height of Dor. Taphath, the daughter of Solomon, was his wife. Banah, the son of Ahalud, and Tanach, and Megiddo, and all Bashan, which is beside Zerathon, below Jezreel. From Bashan to Abel Mecholah, as far as the other side of Jokmeam. Ben-Geber and Ramoth Gilead, the towns of Jair, the son of Manasseh, which are in Gilead, were his. The region of Argob, which is in Bashan, right? Which comes to be where those fat cows live, right? Everybody remembers where Bashan is, because the fat cows live there. Prophets are real prophets sounding, aren't they? 60 great cities with walls and bronze bars were his. Abinadab, the son of Iddo, and Mahanaim, Ahimaaz, and Naphtali. He also married Basemath, the daughter of Solomon. Banah, the son of Hushai, and Asher, and Beelah. Jehoshaphat, the son of Paruah, and Issachar. Shimei, the son of Elah, and Benjamin. Geber, the son of Uri, in the land of Gilead, the country of Sihon, king of the Amorites, and of Og, king of Bashan. And he was the only deputy who was in the land. What does that mean? He was the only resident manager in the land that formerly held a bunch of giants. And he was the one that took personal interest in making sure that people did what they were supposed to do and didn't get influenced, right? So that's a commendation of him. The other deputies probably lived in Jerusalem and simply administered their deputyship or whatever, their control by virtue of just good accountants. But he actually lived there. Some benefits to it, certainly. So he has all of these people as part of his administration, right? You'll notice a substantial measure of nepotism involved here, right? That was pretty characteristic. Nepotism isn't necessarily a bad thing, right? No? Yeah, it's not a bad thing. It can be done poorly. You can have, oh boy, I'm gonna be old now. What's the movie with Chris Farley in it? The Brake Pants? Juan's gonna remember this movie, right? It's a serious lowbrow comedy. What's the name? David Spade and Chris Farley in it. His dad takes over a brake pad.
Oh, it's
Tommy Boy, that's it, Tommy Boy. Tommy Boy is an idiot. And that's bad nepotism, right? But the point being, and this is acknowledged all over the world, that people who were raised in the king's household or raised to be married into the king's household and were considered worthy spouses had an advantage in maintaining the structure of the king, loyalty to the king. Obviously, people can make their own decisions. European monarchies often were in the most danger from their own relatives, right? Because they still recognized that this was the case. Anyway, but a substantial record, and this is all peacetime, right? If you have a list like this from David, you have a lot of guys responsible for bloodshed, right? You have a lot of people that are responsible for when they list the men of valor, right? It's how many people did they kill? How many people did they kill? How many people did they kill? When Solomon's list is here, how much produce did they bring into the household? And how much economic benefit did they bring to the king's household? That's an advancement in their civilization. All right, so we'll stop there. Any questions or comments?
I did notice one thing.
Yeah.
When you divide the 12 districts, it doesn't do it by tribes, and he exempts
No.
Judah, so that's gonna cause some problems down the road.
Yeah, I think that was intentional. Sometimes in modern times that has caused all sorts of problems, right? European nations did that after World War II. We just started drawing lines disregarding where historic peoples had occupied and those kind of things, created civil wars all over the place. And so, yeah, it may be, but I think it was intentional again to centralize and consolidate the management of the nation, right, and force people essentially to work together. And if you're not Solomon the Wise, it probably is a bad idea, right? Even here in El Paso, and this is just reality, but I know of at least 3 families that bought a house in the Northeast and couldn't tolerate living there. They were driven out of their neighborhood functionally by the way they were treated by their neighbors because they had the wrong amount of melanin in their skin. That's in El Paso. So People don't get along without wise rule, let's just say. And we don't have much wise rule in on this. So.
Sounds like we're not bringing in the kingdom.
No, we're definitely not the kingdom, going out to Matthew. No, we certainly aren't under that wise rule by a long shot, right? But there's subjective amounts of wise rule we would benefit from if we would simply start voting a little better, right? Okay. Any other comments? Thank you, Chance, for that. Yeah.
I can see your Hebrew studies have allowed you to rip these names off.
I might be wrong.
No, you
Uh,
pretty good.
To speak with confidence.
yeah. Some of these, I'm sure that some Jewish person would tell me that I was doing it wrong.
Well, it was very impressive.
But there's some of it is that we actually don't know everything.
Yeah.
We don't know even the Hebrew people. That's why we point. I can show you the points here in a second if you want to see it. They had to add vowels into their language because people didn't know how to pronounce it anymore. It was all consonantal. Imagine right to left, all rammed together, no spaces, because the stuff they were writing on was too expensive, and they just knew how to pronounce the word, and eventually they lost that ability. And the Masoretes put in the vowel points, and that's what we learned. That's what we learned, but we might be right. We might not be right. So anyway, all right. Let's pray. Father, thank you for this day. We thank you for your word. Thank you for your covenant faithfulness to your people Israel, both the unconditional covenant made to Abraham and David, but also the conditional covenants, such as those also made to David and made to Solomon and those of his lineage, that if they were faithful to you, that you would bless them in the rulership of the people. Thank you for that. We look for the kingdom that is to come, ultimately. We thank you for that reality in the future. In your son's name we pray.